Hello, everybody, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris Chan Quickie article. And in the words of the immortal song by My Chemical Romance, have you heard the news that you're dead? No one ever had much nice to say. I think they never liked you anyway. You'll take me from the hospital bed. Wouldn't be grand if we knew exactly what you plan, and wouldn't it be great if we were dead? Oh, dead, tongue-tied in observation. You never fell in love. What did you get? What you deserve. The ending of your... Anyway, point aside, that album's turning... That song, like, it's like nearly 20 years old, that song as well. Feel old yet? Because I don't. Anyway, Chris and death. And dying is not happening with me. I'm set to live for thousands of years. Right, okay, Chris. If I had to be honest, guys, with Chris's health, I would give him 10, maybe. If Chris sees 50, I will be very, very surprised. Still, death is a concept that Chris has a notable hard time understanding and or coping with, be it the death of a human, or an animal, or even an imaginary friend. While Chris certainly has the capacity to grieve, and has undergone several periods of grieving in his life in response to deaths in his family, his other reactions towards deaths are considerably more perplexing. His poor reactions to death most likely come from Chris's near inability to empathize. I swear this is like the 4th article in a row where they say that a common symptom of autism is the inability to empathize, as though it was just something that's just surgically removed at birth, and childish thought patterns. Children often don't understand death, usually just thinking it's sleeping forever, or just leaving, or, in Chris's mind, merged with their counterpart from C197. Chris, being a child inside, can only resort to these clumsy analogies to understand death. So, let's crack this cold one open with the boys with family. Various ancestors. Chris claimed that at Aunt Karina's funeral, his ancestors wished him a safe trip to Ohio to meet Julie. Clearly, they must have been having a laugh afterwards before they finally passed on. Aunt Karina, 1934 to 2009. Chris's aunt, Karina Inge, passed away in February of 2009 from lung cancer. When Chris informed Julie that his aunt was dying, Julie insisted that Chris visit her in the hospital, which he had not considered doing. I think that just about says it all, doesn't it? Despite the fact that, I mean, again, I visited, various members of my family when they've been ill and stuff like that. Even for 2 weeks in March when my dad was seriously ill after following a stroke, even I visited him in the moments I could, outside of having to do things around the house and take care of other people and stuff like that. But you still, you know what, make time. He asked Bob about visiting her, and she dissuaded him, saying she wouldn't know he was there, implying, if true, that Karina might have also had a form of dementia or would be too sick to talk to him. However, he did get the chance to tell Karina that he loved her over the phone before she died. Karina's funeral happened to fall on Chris's birthday, which also happened to be Shrove Tuesday, also known as Fat Tuesday. When has Shrove Tuesday ever been known as Fat? I have never, in all my years, ever known Shrove Tuesday to be called Fat Tuesday. I know Mardi Gras, yeah, absolutely, but Fat Tuesday, though, I have never heard it being called that before. A Christian holiday that in some churches involves pancake dinners. Naturally, Chris was more concerned about missing out on the pancakes at his church at home than he was about the funeral of his own aunt. When the "I know how to be sad because my dog died" excuse fails, Chris usually follows up with an offhand mention of his Aunt Karina. If that fails, the deaths of his many sweethearts tends to follow. Such as, well, Bob Chandler. Actual noted examples, Bob Chandler. After a long battle with heart failure, the life of Chris's father, Bob, came to an end in September of 2011, while he was being hospitalized in the Martha Jefferson Hospital's ICU. In an unreleased call with Jackie, Chris broke down sobbing over his father's death. The call, referred to by fans as the Black Tape, was sealed out of empathy for Chris. In an email, Chris told Jackie, "My heavier cries for my father's passing is really hitting me bad," and lamented that in a previous dream the Grim Reaper had promised that he would not claim Bob until 2015. It's a stupid fallacy to follow anyway, because one, if we are going to assume Chris really did believe that to be true, it reveals something that, well, Chris probably hadn't anticipated. Three things really. The first is that this still means his father was going to die, something that Chris probably should have been ready to anticipate and ready to start making that transition into the sort of person they hoped he would become much earlier. Two, the fact that Chris believes this to be fact means to suggest that Chris will continue to still take his dad almost for granted during this time, which, yes, Chris absolutely did and will continue to do. And three, even when this was proven not to be true, it doesn't even seem to occur to Chris whatsoever that, guess what? Just because Chris is under the impression that still what he believes goes and that it can't be counteracted. Which, it's the sort of thing that, you know, when it's a death or an accident in the family or anything like that, or an emergency, it showcases that Chris has no control whatsoever. And I imagine that this, again, a lot of people are sort of heavily under the cosh when it comes to coming to terms with the fact that this thing's completely beyond their control. But eventually, over time, you just start learning to get over it. There are some things, however, that you feel like you should be in control over, but nothing goes your way. And there are, like, smaller things like that, you know. I can understand in that respect, but Chris, be serious about this. This is not the same as, you know, like missing the bus by about 10 seconds. This is you thoroughly accepting the knowledge that your dad was obviously not in good health, and you still think that his time was going to be in 2015. It's a good thing Chris probably never told Bob about this, because, well, I don't really feel as if, like, Bob's frequent trips to hospital or his ill-frequent moaning during his final months would have dissuaded Chris. In a 31st of March 2012 Facebook message, Chris expressed a desire for Bob's ghost to haunt the dreams of anyone who doesn't like him, putting him on the exact same level as his dead dog. While this was an understandable reaction to discovering plans that trolls were going to dig her up, or discovering a webcomic that contained what he considered a mockery of her memory, his threat to send Bob's ghost after people is equal parts disrespectful and unreasonable. Surprisingly, this would not be the only unreasonable thing that Chris would do for his father's memory. In a Facebook post from June 2013, Chris laments that he had more freedom when his father was still alive. What an incredibly selfish prick he is, isn't he? And goes on to complain about he has to take time out of his day to serve and protect his mother. What that constitutes, and considering we know where this ended up, I would like to assume Chris had no concept whatsoever and probably was lying out of his ass to save face. Despite the fact that nobody would have believed it anyway. Knowing Chris, this presumably means that he sat around in his room and played video while his elderly father did most of the work around the house. In C-Log 09042017, Mr. C, Chris, while reading letters from his late father, displays emotion over him, tearing up at times. Well, up until the point where Chris read out a letter from his dad saying that Sonichu should be sort of like a mascot or a symbol or some sort of hero for autism, and Chris really scoffed and basically like rolled his eyes, despite the fact that, you know, Bob actually meant this with all the best intentions in the world, and Chris just dismissed it out of hand. So whether you want to say those are crocodile tears, well, sometimes it will be a little bit hard to tell, because for some reason in this video Chris had his fan on blaring in the background, and it kind of makes it hard to hear him at times. During the Idea Guy saga, and rather disturbing events that took place within it, Joshua convinced Chris that Bob had reincarnated as a Sonichu with plaid-coloured fur, in reference to his nickname, the Internet Lumberjack. Chris later retconned his design to a much simpler plain red design because plaid fur was too much effort. And that's all and Chris really did say that, by the way, and turn up in Quickville alongside Ted Bundy, as in, yes, the actual Ted Bundy, because Chris was led to believe that Ted Bundy was completely innocent. This was revealed in a Count Dankula podcast, and even Dankula himself, in his typical Scottish way, was so unbelievably perplexed. Which, even if you've ever been to Scotland before, you'll know there'll be some things that happen in that country that are almost beyond imagining. Especially if you've ever had a wee drum of the hard stuff. Using an autistic man-child's dead father to troll them is disgusting as it is. Convincing them that said father is still alive in another dimension to help with their extortion efforts is on another level of fucked. And yes, that's true, because, well, to be fair, con artists I don't really feel have much in the form of like legitimate morality, because honestly, if I did that sort of thing, I imagine that I would have been made homeless, or I would have been arrested, because, and bear in mind, it's the fucked up part about is that they got away with it as well. They faced no repercussions, they faced no consequences, and I have no idea, but they are it's you know what I mean? They absolutely got away with it. You may say they didn't, but they got exactly as... They probably would have got a lot more out of Chris than what they demanded out of him. Chris, to this day, still believes they're bullshit. And, well, again, the job has been done. And will probably never accept that his father is gone forever. While in many cases, believing a loved one is in a better place after death is actually a very common and usually quite healthy way of coping with their passing, literally believing they are alive in your own fantasy dimension is actually extremely uncommon and extremely unhealthy. Barbara Chandler, 1941, even to this day, at 84 years of age. I really have none. Chris on whether he has plans in place for after Barbara passes away. I would suggest the idea that, well, even when this was being written, Chris probably the government would probably have plans, because goodness knows because if that doesn't happen, we're definitely going to be having like Idea Guys 2.0, because there will be people who will see this as an advantage, because there are some legitimate trolls like the Idea Guys and Blue Spike especially. They go so far beyond the realm of comprehension that goodness knows how far it would have, how much further it would have gone if they weren't caught out, or they didn't just decide to drop the bombshell to make Chris look like an absolute idiot. Barbara is Chris's surviving parent. Alongside Bob, who Chris entered a protected period of grieving for after his passing, Barbara was one of the few people in Chris's life that he cared about enough to generally fear her passing. Because it meant Chris would be left with nobody, that's probably why. And as hard as it may seem, the realization, especially when Chris had already kind of blacklisted himself from other members of his family because of what he did, it's fair to say that Barbara would have been the only one, perhaps the sole person that Chris is blood related to, they would have had any influence whatsoever. The only one that even comes slightly close would probably be Cole Smithy, but Cole Smithy probably hates. It's hard to say who Cole hates probably more, Chris or Bob, but I'm sure even by Cole, and again, we know Cole and Barbara are never ever going to see eye to eye. They'll probably never see each other ever again. Cole would have looked at this, and even to what Chris did, was as being, well, absolutely disgusted. It's probably also a good thing that we never once heard what Cole Smithy's thoughts were on the scandal, because, well, I think he just didn't want to have anything to do, so it's probably for the best. I don't recall anybody ever pressing Cole for any. Anyway, let's just get to it. And Barbara used to manipulate Chris into following orders on multiple occasions. One such instance of this was in 2011, prior to Bob's death, in which she threatened to commit the S word as a last resort to stop Chris from his poorly thought out plan to attend MagFest in Maryland. That year, by sleeping in his car, as he did not have money to afford a hotel room. A distraught Chris backpedaled, receiving only more guilt-tripping and down payment on some video games as a consolation prize. Barbara used her health as a scare tactic for so long that it instilled paranoia into Chris. On one occasion, when Barbara failed to answer the phone when Chris called her while out, Chris panicked and called 911 for a welfare check. In November of 2015, Chris released Family Needs to Appreciate Family, where he addressed Cole Smithy, David Anlin Chandler, and Carol Suzanne Chandler to visit Barb before her time runs out. That was nearly 10 years ago, and the fact that Barbara is still kicking is quite astounding. But it might also say a lot about how insidious Barbara might have been, because, well, David apparently didn't make any response. Carol didn't make a response. We know Cole definitely did not make a response. And Chris never thought that to reach out to his Uncle Tom and Aunt Harriet either. So maybe it's possibly true that Chris is the last person on Earth that Barbara can have any sort of effect over. In November of 2019, Chris posted a tweet where he copes with the mortality of his mother, imagining her becoming a part human / part rose stew hybrid after death, in the same vein that he believed Barb reincarnated into Robert Chew after death. Had I not healed her, she would be dead last August. This is Chris on soul bonding with Barbara, documented in November of 2021. Again, because Chris is too stupid to realise that this is the sort of thing that could be used in evidence, because this was when Chris was in the clink. And for those who don't know, even jails will have their level of policing that goes on inside, especially if people are overheard making certain comments about trials that are pending. There was, I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but yeah, that's Chris. You probably should. Why on earth Chris said that? I have no idea. Following Chris's August 2021 arrest for incest with Barbara, which saw him confined to Central Virginia Regional Jail for nearly 2 years, he began to shift in his attitude towards her. Chris began claiming that soul bonding with her as a method of healing her, and that she would have died without it. Barbara was involved in a traffic collision on the 24th of November 2021. She suffered 2 broken ribs and a concussion. Chris took credit for having healed her with his soul bonding when explaining then that she had survived the crash. Barbara chose to remain living in 14 Branch Lane Court. Despite Chris wanting to move back at the time, Chris claimed that there was a restraining order against himself and Barbara. In a jail letter, he complained that, despite having guided her soul into her rose stew form / body, Barbara's soulless husk still clings on to life inside the house. He further claimed, "It is indeed clear and obvious, especially to all with spiritual and physical ability, that she is sickly, and her passing on is to be from emotions. Yet again, she still lives, and zombie-like as well. And this was and is fact throughout the majority of branching alternate timelines since August 2021, wherein she had died in most of them by now." Whatever that means. Indicating that he had been meditating over her death in his selfish desire to inherit the house from her. You know, with this whole talk of soul bonding, I'm actually almost surprised that Chris didn't just drag Barbara out onto the curb and forced her to bend down and literally put her teeth on the curb. Wow, that got dark really, really quick, didn't it? Chris himself, 1982 to the present. And believe me, in dreams and even in moments within my mind while awake, I have seen and felt that death light. Not only is it the most horrifying thing ever, but I am long not ready for it yet. That's actually a little bit curious, because even Chris is trying to deny the fact that, well, he is mortal, if you will. In a conversation with the Wikipedia sysop Cogsdev, Chris mentioned that he had been receiving recurring visions of himself walking into a bright light, which he one day hoped would be prevented from appearing by getting a sweetheart. After the surreal conclusion of the love quest in 2018, it is unknown if he still gets these visions. In a Facebook post on the 30th of October 2013, Chris stated that he had become so stressed out, specifically over the revelation that his high school gal pals did not actually like him much at all, that he had contemplated K-wording himself multiple times. According to Chris, the only reasons he did not go through with it are painfully obvious. This shows just how much Chris's mentality has drained, and how badly he needs the professional help he so stubbornly refuses to get. Of course, this could well be Chris exaggerating and trying to gain pity, as he has done in the past, and as his mother allegedly also has, or at least used to have, a habit of doing. In all seriousness, however, the S word is no laughing matter, and this should be looked at with caution. In a 2019 Discord chat between his fantasy enablers, Chris had claimed that he is set to live for thousands of years. In August of 2020, Chris, pretending that his body was being possessed by Sonichu, uploaded a video will, apparently in case his body vanished from this dimension 1218. You know, after reading all that, there's only really one thing I want to say before we move on from just talking about all of that. But when you put it into that perspective, I think the only reason why Chris even bothers playing along with these, fantasies at all is, well, you probably know why as well. It's because, well, it's to masquerade the unfortunate implications that Chris's life is miserable, it is completely without hope, and Chris only wants to believe it's not true in any which way by saying that life is actually brilliant. It is a decline of reality. Nothing more, nothing less. Pets. Paddy Chandler. Paddy was the Chandler's family dog who died in June of 2006. Chris apparently drew a picture of a crying Sonichu face on the signature confirming the euthanasia process. As seen in the image used in this article, Paddy also appeared in the comic, immortalized as a furry character named Paddy-chan. This is particularly disturbing in that Chris has apparently decided to deny his dog the afterlife that he presumably believes in favor of locking her in his own personal hell. To Chris, her death is the greatest tragedy of his life, which he often compares to the deaths of other people's family members and loved ones. Unsurprisingly, every single person he has said this to has become horribly offended. In Chris's plea to Clyde Cash, he equates Ryan Cash's death with Paddy's, and in the father call, he equates it to the death of Matthew Devoria's mother in the 9/11 attacks. Now, one thing I want to just say for the moment right now is that this was because Paddy Chandler was an actual dog, unlike the other people who were just fabrications that were created by the trolls. Because it's one of those things that we have to understand that Chris was being completely, because if there's one thing I will absolutely say is that Chris has never really at any point disrespected Paddy Chandler's memory or what she meant to Chris, because on the face of it you could say that Paddy meant almost everything to Chris, and I think the trolls were showing in considerable bad taste for not considering the fact that, well, it was true. And I know, again, a lot of people will get mad about Chris for this, but then again, what experience, or rather, what beings out there does Chris actually hold any emotional value to whatsoever? Maybe certainly not his friends, because it was completely unreciprocated. So then what? On the 1-year anniversary of her death, Chris even broke down in tears and had to be consoled by his mother. By comparison, the death of any sweetheart resulted in a few days of mourning at best. It should be noted, though, that despite all of Chris's fondness for Paddy, her memory was still not safe from being defiled by trolls manipulating him. Polo. Polo was a cat born sometime in 2003 that was adopted by Chris in 2015 and who passed away in May of 2018. On the 20th of May 2018, Chris posted an urgent tweet to Twitter stating that Polo was having difficulty breathing and that he needed money from eBay in order to take Polo to the vet. Following a wave of backlash due to how Chris was seemingly using Polo's sickly condition as a way to get sympathy donations, Chris would delete the tweet. Despite his plea for donations, Chris announced on Twitter that Polo had passed away in the early hours of the 20th of May 2018, presumably due to the aforementioned breathing difficulties and or other natural causes. According to Chris, Polo was buried right next to Paddy's resting place. Sorbet. Sorbet was a cat Chris had adopted in 2016, who passed away in May of 2018. In May 2017, Sorbet wandered out of the house and was hit by a car. Fortunately, Sorbet would survive the incident after Chris took him to the vet. However, in a video about the solar eclipse from August 2017, Sorbet was shown to seemingly have difficulties breathing. On the 17th of May 2018, Chris posted to Facebook in order to announce that Sorbet had gone missing after he was let outside. Chris would put posters with information relating to Sorbet on several telephone poles near the areas in hopes of finding him. A lot of people entertain the idea that Sorbet just sort of wandered off for a quiet place to die in peace. However, Sorbet would not return. As in a text message from October 2018, Chris confirmed to a fan that Sorbet never came back and pronounced him dead. In order to cope with the loss of Sorbet, Chris claimed that Sorbet's soul had supposedly been reincarnated into Dimension C-197 as an anthropomorphic cat, and that he had since then been able to meet with him. Now, why on earth, so many cats? Because this isn't even the end of it, by the way. Multiple other now-deceased cats once resided within 14 Branch Lane Court, the most notable of them being Scamper, 2006 to 2014, a cat that unfortunately passed away as a result of the 2014 house fire, and Patches, October 2018 to November 2018, a kitten that passed away due to complications related to pneumonia only 1 week after Chris had adopted him. Then there's also Skittles, Kitty, and what was the other? There was another one as well. Posey as well, that would all die. Posey in particular kind of had a very similar sort of experience with just like Patches, but that it does beg the question. However, how do these cats keep on ending up at Branch Lane Court? Do people just abandon them, or is there just some large brooding clan of homeless kittens wandering about? And of course, as you might suspect, pneumonia and stuff like that, especially during the colder months, of course things were gonna escalate to that extent. But how they were unfortunate enough to end up outside 14 Branch Lane Court is something that probably even the cat gods above, even they probably were like, shit, why did you do that for? But that isn't related to just cats, however. Snoopy. Snoopy was a dog that was adopted by Barbara alongside Clover in May 2012, who passed away in July of 2021. Snoopy had apparently suffered a leg injury before he was adopted. Well, we heard before he was adopted. A lot of people say it happened after he was adopted, because apparently Snoopy fell off a pile of clothes at 14 Branch Lane and had permanently altered his leg, causing him to have trouble walking for the remainder of his life. Following a long period of seemingly improper feeding habits, Snoopy died in his sleep during the early hours of 14th of July 2021. I hope that's just because if Snoopy was purposely, not fed properly, I am literally going to go berserk. Because we know that Chris has also done very devious things with Snoopy and Clover by feeding them chicken noodle soup, not actually having proper licensing for actually having, like flu shots or anything like that, or keeping track of, things like rabies, which, why they were even allowed to stay, because, well, in the articles we will get to when we talk about Clover and Snoopy, you wonder why they even bothered adopting dogs at all. After Snoopy's passing, Chris posted a eulogy dedicated to him on Twitter. In it, he explained that his neighbour and their daughter helped him bury Snoopy by a tree, making a stone mound around the burial to indicate where the body was. Chris was understandably distraught and saddened over the death of Snoopy. However, he still remained confident in his coping mechanism, the dimensional merge. On Twitter, Chris said that Snoopy was aware of the merge, which meant that him and Snoopy would reunite after the merge was complete. Chris would also bizarrely claim that he had seen an anthropomorphic version of Snoopy from another dimension during his burial, stating that he looked like a tall dog guy. Hooray! Imaginary friends. Chris is also concerned over the deaths of his imaginary friends, such as Sonichu and his pals. Since Chris believes all cartoon characters exist in some universe, and he had created Sonichu's, he feels that if he were to reboot the comics, that would mean that Sonichu and his friends would all die, and that they would all reincarnate into their newer rebooted versions. Being his love and joy, the last thing on Chris's mind would be to kill his creations, but yet he is perfectly fine with freezing them in time with his hiatus on the series. The Idea Guys allegedly extorted Chris out of thousands of dollars by telling him that they would destroy Quickville, which would lead to the deaths of Chris's imaginary friends. Chris paid up, even put his own house at risk of foreclosure by skipping a mortgage payment to do so. Not a good idea. And if you are, going through this for the first time thinking to yourself, that can't possibly be true. Oh yes, this is true, by the way. They're not joking when they say that happened. Ironically, even when Chris inevitably does pass on and go forth to meet Godbear, he will still be remembered, not only for his life and the many humorous misadventures in it, but for his comics. Thus, it can be said Sonichu will never truly die. Until people just forget and move on, and nobody bothers to, keep the continuity going. Anyway, moving on. Simona Rosechew. During the Asperchew saga, a recurring theme was Evan's legal claims in regard to Simona Rosechew as a derivative of his character Simonchu. While early demands were for Chris to edit his old strips to remove Simona entirely from continuity, later Evan consented to letting Chris keep Simona's early appearances, on the grounds that he kill her at a later date. Chris, not surprisingly, totally lost his shit, showing a much stronger emotional attachment to an empty, one-dimensional fictional character than he has managed for any living creature other than his dog. Finally, after being faced with the threat of legal action, Chris finally killed Simona in issue 10, though not before she laid an egg out of wedlock with her baby daddy Wild, though of course the act of laying the egg was never shown or even mentioned, which hatched into Sandy Rosechew. Simona's death continued to haunt Chris long afterwards. Well, he says it does anyway. This led to him reviving Simona around May of 2014, more than 4 years after her demise. It should be noted, as revealed in the Alec Benson Leary phone calls, Chris considers cartoon characters to be real, living creatures that exist in some other world resemblant of Toontown from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Simona's death was as real to him as that of any of the family members or sweethearts, perhaps even more so. Troll manipulation. A favourite tactic of trolls is to manipulate Chris into reacting to scenarios involving death, a concept a concept in contrast to Chris's childish mentality, and thus guaranteeing he would either react in odd ways or in ways that could be used as ammunition against him for future trolling. The scenarios, though fictional, were presented to Chris under the pretense that they were true. While Chris genuinely went along with the claims under pressure from troll manipulation, he did maintain some skepticism, such as when he expressed disbelief to Casey months later on the Ryan Cash S-word scenario. The first death scenario trolls experimented with was in October of 2008, was that a fan of whose father had passed away from alcoholism. When asking Chris for advice on coping, Chris briefly replied that the fan will recover from the father's accident and then advised the fan not to become an alcoholic. Terrific stuff, Chris. That's like A1 material right there. A few months later, another death scenario was invented by trolls involving the Ryan Cash character, designed to provoke Chris over his lack of work ethic on the Sonichu comic. The fabrication was that Ryan had been a Sonichu fan and had committed the S-word when Chris stopped updating it. Trolls badgered Chris over multiple chats to keep acknowledging the death. Not satisfied with his brief replies on the death being sad, trolls then elevated matters by having the Clyde Cash character threaten Chris with revenge over the death of his brother. A frustrated Chris recorded a video in which he tried to reason with Clyde and put his foot in his mouth by suggesting that if Clyde got a girlfriend, it would help him get over the death. Again, we have to remind ourselves once again, Chris was under the assumption that these trolls were legitimate and that these were real people, and that what they came up with was actually, there was solid grounds for all of it. And Chris believed every single word for whatever reason. This is a point that's actually worth considering a little bit, because why did Chris just believe this without any prompting that, they could be completely nuts and they didn't know what they were talking about? It's possibly suggested when Chris put a memorial to Ryan in Sonichu issue 8. Also, I'd like to take this moment to remember a Sonichu fan, Mr. Ryan Cash, who committed the S-word when I impulsively said I would stop the comic series in protest against the trolls of the ED page. Ryan, I'm sorry. That's the entire memorial, by the way. It's just a throwaway jargon about how it claimed that it was his fault. Well, Chris's fault, I should say. Sweethearts. Sometimes I remember her, but I have moved on. This is Chris on Panda Halo, by the way. Trolls also carried out the death scenario fabrications using a few of their sweetheart characters. Chris had blunt responses to the supposed deaths and seemingly adjusted quickly when another sweetheart character professed to be in love with him. When Panda Halo's character arc ended, Chris believed that her silence meant that she had been a victim of the Australian Black Saturday bushfires, despite her location being hundreds of kilometers away. Shortly after her apparent death, the Julie Sweetheart character was introduced to Chris. In a mumble chat, where trolls directed the conversation to Panda Halo's fate, Chris said, "It's okay though, at least I have a good woman who's willing to be at my side at this point." 9 months later, Sonichu issue 9 featured a special memorial to Panda Halo, and a sequence in which she dies off-screen in a building fire after saving her Pokemon, Chloe Rosechew and Blaze Bob Sonichu, so they wouldn't burn with her. Chris also dedicated all of Sonichu issue 10 to Panda Halo's memory. This would be almost touching, if the alleged dedication didn't wholly consist of how awesome Chris was for using Panda's cover artwork. The Sarah May character claimed to attempt the S-word after Chris accidentally called her Julie multiple times in a call. After Chris attempted to talk her down, Sarah May went offline still claiming she would K herself. Julie, also in the chat, was playing along, and did not react to Sarah's S-word attempt in any human-like fashion. Yet it did not occur to Chris that Julie's behaviour was unnatural. Chris told Julie, "Well, at least I still have you." Chris then made recorded quick shout out to Sarah May, in which the only reason he offended as to why she shouldn't commit the S word was that he would be sad without her. And that's it, by the way. There's literally nothing else to actually convince somebody why, staying on this earth would be in any way beneficial whatsoever. That's what Chris is deciding to go for. When the Ivy character was forced to end due to Rocky Shoemaker's intervention, Trolls came up with the scenario that she committed the S word by, well, after being upset she couldn't be in contact with Chris. Chris uploaded Quick Boyfriend as a memorial, a poorly sung remake of Avril Lavigne's happy bouncy pop punk song, with lyrics changed to be about how much Chris would like women to date him. That doesn't even deserve a single clap, by the way. That's Chris's attempt at as tribute, by the way. Honestly, sometimes I feel like even Chris's life isn't really a life. It's more like a social experiment, or somebody, or God having a giggle and deciding, yeah, we'll do that instead. Chris included pictures of several past sweethearts in the video, making it less of a tribute to Ivy and more of a monument to Chris's failures. And also dancing like he's trying to get the F out of Dodge by doing the shuffle. Ivy's demise was incorporated into Sonichu issue 9 in the form of a gruesome accidental death, which involved having gotten her neck broken with elevator wires after falling through the elevator for law. Mary Jo is gone. I feel for you. But you should move on to try and find another woman who will treat you about as good or possibly better than her. Suck it up and move on like a man would. I tell you as a man who had to do the same thing a few times in the past too. This is apparently Chris's advice, which Chris sucks at giving advice, by the way. Are you beginning to notice a little theme in this? In a mailbag answer to the troll scenario of a fan grieving over the loss of his girlfriend, Chris clearly states how he believes a death should be approached by a man, which includes finding another woman right away and a specific lack of grieving, and tells the traumatized fan that he should simply move on to a better woman since his girlfriend's death, not only being completely asinine, but also outlining that he believes women to be replaceable and possibly interchangeable. Is there like an article to this? Women's rights. I thought so. Terror and assassination. Chris has a very juvenile understanding of terror and its effect on the world. On the 9/11 terror attack, Chris wrote it as the worst day in 2001, summarizing it as an airplane was stolen and crashed in New York. I think there was a little bit more to it than that, but Chris is technically not wrong. 8 years later, which, considering that Chris calls it the worst day, it makes what happens next seem all the more bizarre and jarring. Trolls exploited Chris's childish mentality in order to manipulate him into making the Twin Falling Towers video, suggesting that he should mock Clyde Cash by saying he's as weak as the Twin Towers. Chris failed to discern that he was being set up, producing a video in which he used his mouse cursor to crash into a picture of the buildings, while making explosion sound effects and taunting Clyde, after it inevitably backfired on him, and due to what was absolutely a myriad of deafening backlash over somebody doing something like that, Chris recorded apology for 9/11 joke. And by the way, for what it's worth, I should point out is that Chris at no point ever says that he apologizes for offending relatives who died during 9/11. Because the whole video reads about Chris trying to deem forgiveness and then immediately pulled another really poorly tasted joke out of his ass. Because that is legitimately all Chris could do, it would seem. On the November 2015 Paris terror attack, Chris expressed a modicum of grief in his own simple way, but equated the real-life atrocity killed over 120. I remember that. I remember that like it was yesterday, and it's coming up to 10 years. Over 120 people with the actions of a cartoon villain. You've got to be shitting me, Chris. Really? A cartoon villain? Suggesting he still has a poor grasp over the difference between reality and fantasy. At some point in fall 2020, Chris tried asking No to kill someone. That almost completely changes the complexion of the game again, that doesn't it? If that is true. The S word. Taboos in solitude. It is taboo in solitude culture. The moment you threaten it, you're not considered a solitude. An idea guy posing as Grizel Rosechew talking Chris out of contemplating the S word. Chris considered the... And again, I'm sorry, but this is going to get like dark really, really quickly, so I'm just going to sort of just get to the point, really. In October 2013, after discovering that past events and friends were nothing more than trolls or arranged acquaintances. However, he ruled out the S word, not only because of Bob and his pets, but also because of his belief, at the time, that the S word would leave him in limbo. In April of 2018, during a chat with the Idea Guys in which they psychologically abused Chris, he commented that he would commit the S word. The Idea Guys then talked him out of it, considering it by drilling it into his mind that the S word is taboo in solitude culture and that Chris would not be a solitude if he committed the S word. In June of 2018, when talking about the infamous line "zapped to the extreme," Chris said he literally feels electricity in his body, then states he isn't going to K himself. In November 2020, Chris had a vision about how Chris Chan doppelgangers had been spawned up by a spell Jacob Sockness had cast. In his vision, he believed that one such doppelganger to be working at Manchester High and would die either by the S word or a heart attack, so that the doppelganger's power could be absorbed by the main Chris Chan for breaking the Iron Curtain. On the 19th of July 2021, Alan and his friend Bella joked to each other about how there being a plan to get Chris to K himself in their chess club Discord server. Alan said, "I thought the plan was to get him to K himself," to which Bella responded, "Yeah, but by getting others to tell him they're Jesus and then they hate him and then they say, 'Oh no, those people are so mean,' and then he pays me." The chess club server was leaked in August, and which Alan claimed he and Bella had been making edgy jokes and that there was no plan to kill Chris, also pointing out a lack of proof that the two had been serious. During the jail saga, rumours about Bella's comment were sent to Chris, who then falsely claimed in a jail letter in response to a fan's questions that he foreknew all about Bella and the setup and her want to tempt me into the S word. Chris repeated more misinformation in an October 2023 video in which he suggested that the incest call had been fabricated as a plot to get him to kill himself. As opposed to, but he still went ahead and did it anyway, so you say this with, whatever. Dimension C-197 as Chris's version of heaven. Following the Idea Guy saga, which affirmed to Chris his dimensional beliefs, Chris began to think of alternate dimension C-197 as heaven. He stated that he believes his deceased pets have reincarnated as characters, and that his father is alive again. He also stated that Marvel writer Stan Lee's soul had merged with his C-197 counterpart. So sure was Chris in this that he even tried to console a woman whose father passed away by telling her that her father's soul had likely gone to C-197. Wow. Okay. And by the way, that is actually the end of that, and Whew, that was a wild ride if ever there was one, guys. Because you know what's really stupid, actually, when you think about this, is that Chris's methodology seems to be is under the impression that life continues forever, that there is a definitive start but there is no end point whatsoever. And to be honest, I'm sort of I'm almost verging into the direction myself of saying that there probably isn't a heaven after all. Not because I don't want to believe there is. I believe there is for other people, but for now, I just wonder if it's even worth all of this praise or thinking that anything good happens once people are dead. All I can say for Chris is, as well, for someone who claims that they're going to be living for thousands of years, imagine what would happen if Chris, well, would you think Chris would still hold on to this idea if, let's say, Chris one of these days got into an accident and was critically injured, or if Chris was involved in an accident and was killed instantly? Do you think Chris would still hold on to that belief? You tell me. And because there was frequent uses of the S word throughout this video, I'm going to actually do you guys a favor, and I'm going to leave links to organizations that can support people for wherever you may be affected. So I'll make sure to leave those down below, because it's something that nobody should have to go through, and it's something that nobody should have to contemplate, because there is still so much more to life, and there's still so much just waiting for you guys out there. And that might be probably one of the most important things about this entire article, is that even at the knowledge of death, there is still life to be had. There is still things to do, and for me right now, there is work to be done. There is always more work.